Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Social Studies. This is the last episode of Social Studies for the year. As long as you're watching this in 2021, I can't promise you that if you're watching it in the future sometime that there won't be more. But this is it for the year. So I figured I'd do my Mr. Betts and... No, I'm not going to sing. All right, but we're going to go, there's going to be a Mr. Betts video that goes with this that I want you to watch. I'm going to go really quickly here just to tell you what to watch for so that you know what is going to be on the little quiz that you have today, as well as the quote-unquote real quiz, which will be later this week. So Civil War, is a war between the northern states and the southern states, and we went over all the causes of the Civil War earlier. There's not just one cause of the war, although if you had to narrow it down, slavery is the one that underlies all of these other causes. Everything, states' rights is a big one. A lot of times people claim states' rights was the real cause of the Civil War, sectionalism, but all of these things are related to slavery, the unwillingness to compromise. So slavery really underlies everything. Secession is kind of the act of seceding and breaking away from the United States. That's really the thing that lights the fire when South Carolina secedes or declares independence from the Union, aka the United States, after the election of Lincoln in 1860, because they are afraid that Honest Abe was a liar. And although Honest Abe said he would not outlaw slavery, the southern states feared he would, so they said, we're out of here when he was elected. The Union was dissolved. Remember, the Union is another name for the United States that was used commonly in the 1800s. It will, during the Civil War, become associated with the North because the North was the United States. The Confederate States are the ones in the South. And after Lincoln is sworn in, he very quickly faces a crisis at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter in South Carolina is the last remaining federal property in South Carolina that has not been taken over away from the federal government, has not been surrendered while James Buchanan was president. Lincoln has to decide whether to surrender the fort or resupply the fort. He attempts to resupply it, starts the violence, South Carolina firing on the fort, and the Union is ultimately forced to surrender the fort, and that's the beginning of the war. President Lincoln is famous now as one of the greatest presidents of all time, not so popular always during the war. Confederate states, you should know that the Confederate states were the southern states that seceded because they wanted to keep slavery as part of their rights, so-called. This is the Confederate battle flag, which we may have talked about. You should know Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederate States. President of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis. On a map, you have the United States or the Union up here, the Confederate States in the South, the border states in between. I'll probably ask you about this. Border states were slave states, states where slavery was legal, but they did not secede from the Union. They remained with the United States. Robert E. Lee is another name you should recognize if you want to sound smart about the Civil War. Robert E. Lee was the top general on the Confederate Army. He had been a United States officer. He was actually offered command of the Union Army, but he betrayed his country and his oath to the Constitution and to the United States, and he fought a war to destroy the United States instead. Ulysses S. Grant, on the other hand, rose to the top rank in the Union Army. Ulysses S. Grant would later become president. You should know that name. The Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863, in the middle of the war. Lincoln issues, actually in 1862, he issues this. It takes effect on January 1st, 1863. It frees all slaves living in states that were in rebellion, which doesn't actually free slaves because the states that were in rebellion were the Confederate states. The border states, which also had slaves, did not have to free their slaves because they were not in rebellion. However, this is still really important because it changes what the war is about, for one thing. It makes it so it is very clear that ending slavery is one of the one of the reasons for fighting this war. That is going to keep other countries like England out of the war because they don't want to be on the side of trying to keep slavery alive when they themselves had already outlawed slavery. It also makes it so that the Fugitive Slave Act is no more. They no longer have to return runaway slaves. And also it opens up so African Americans can fight for the Union. The United States Army will eventually have about 200,000 African American soldiers. So the Emancipation Proclamation is really important, even though it did not technically immediately free any slaves. Gettysburg, a name you should know. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, often called the turning point of the war. The Confederates, who had just been fighting a defensive war. They did not need to attack the North to win this war. They just had to kind of stay put and defend their land. They decide to invade the North. They get as far as Gettysburg. There's a huge, huge 3-day battle. It is a Union victory. The Confederates are forced to retreat after 3 days of intense fighting, including something known as Pickett's Charge, when the Confederates tried marching across this field up the hill, and they were just gunned down. A huge percentage of the Confederate Army was killed at Gettysburg, and they were never again really had much chance of winning the war. The war would drag out for another year and a half, but it was really over after Gettysburg for all practical purposes. Turning point of the war. Vicksburg happened same day out west, gave Union control of the Mississippi River, so that was really a turning point. Now, they had to bury all these bodies in Gettysburg, so they turned part of the battlefield into a national military cemetery. In November of that year, so several months later, Abraham Lincoln goes to dedicate this cemetery, and he gives a famous speech called the Gettysburg Address. There's just a few photos of Lincoln in Gettysburg. There is one of them here. If you look closely, with the top hat is another, and there's the third one. All right, the Gettysburg Address, it's a famous speech, explains why the war was worth fighting, why the U.S. was worth saving, basically rededicates our country to this belief stated in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and saying we have to fight this war, we have to win this war to show that a country can survive based on this idea that all men are created equal. After Gettysburg, the war drags on. William T. Sherman makes a march to the sea. Basically, their plan of the Union was to set up a blockade to stop the South from trading with anyone else or getting help from anyone else. That was a naval blockade. Then they sort of go up the Mississippi River. They invade around this way, and they sort of surround and squeeze. It's called the Anaconda Plan. And then Sherman will make a march to the sea, take the troops through the South, destroying everything along the way. Total war, it's called. They basically destroy civilian properties, farms, telegraph wires, railroad tracks, anything that might help the Confederates win the war. Lincoln runs for re-election. He is re-elected. He is re-elected, defeating George McClellan, one of his former generals who he had fired, who promised to end the war. Now, Lincoln does make one change. He changes his vice president. Instead of Hannibal Hamlin, he picks Andrew Johnson as his vice president. But nobody cares about vice presidents because vice presidents never actually become president, do they? Lincoln doesn't have to worry about that. Uh-oh. So anyways, the war ends in April of 1865. Robert E. Lee surrenders the Confederate Army to Ulysses S. Grant in a little tiny town called Appomattox Courthouse. Ulysses S. Grant was very respectful and generous to the Confederate soldiers, made sure they had food, made sure they were medical supplies, made sure they were treated well, because he knew once that war is over, we're all back to being on the same side again. We're all Americans, and we have to reunite the country. And he didn't also want to give them a reason to keep fighting. All right, why did the Union win? Mostly they had more population, more money, more industry, more factories, more railroads, more everything. The Confederates had shortages of everything because they did not have any industry, and they had very little industry, and the naval blockade was working, so Confederates were short of almost everything. The Confederate losses as Gettysburg played a big role, so ultimately the Union won. The causes, again, we've gone over these just to reiterate. Results of the war. The United States is reunited. That's a big one. The United States is put back together as one. 2, slavery ends. And this is necessary 2. This could be 1. Slavery ends. That is huge. Finally, slavery ends as a result of this war. Southern economy is ruined. Federal government becomes more powerful. 600,000 dead, more injured. All right, Reconstruction. You need to know what this is. Reconstruction is the time period after the war when the U.S. tried to reunite, rebuild, and solve problems caused by slavery. Think about this. The war ends. There are suddenly 4 million people who are now suddenly free, but they have nothing. They have no money. They don't own any property. They don't even own their own homes. They have no education for the most part. It's been illegal to educate them. They have no savings. They have no jobs. They have nothing, literally. And on top of that, they're going to be pretty severely discriminated against. So you can see it's setting up a potential problem that might last generations to try to fix that problem. Reconstruction was an attempt to solve the problems. Lincoln had a plan. He was working on trying to reunite the country. Even before the war ended, he was working on this. He believed that the southern states could not secede. It was illegal to secede, so they never really left the United States. They were just in rebellion, so he wanted to reunite as quickly as possible. Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction are not going to work out. We'll see why in a second. But he also is very concerned about how to bring African Americans up to equality in our society. He originally had not thought this. Frederick Douglass had convinced him, and he had come to believe that all men are created equal, and we had to create a society where all people are equal. Part of this is going to be the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a federal government agency to help African Americans adjust to freedom, help reunite families, provide education. Now, it's only around for a short amount of time, but it does help people make some progress. Schools are opened all over, etc. Lincoln, however, is going to get killed only days after the war ends. He is assassinated by a guy named John Wilkes Booth while attending a play in Washington, D.C. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, takes over. Andrew Johnson will continue with Lincoln's plans, but Andrew Johnson does not believe that blacks and whites should be equal. He is actually a Southerner and is in favor of white supremacy. So he will carry out the plans, but maybe not quite as enthusiastically. The United States will amend the Constitution 3 times. The 13th Amendment will officially abolish slavery everywhere in the U.S. That is important because remember that Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court said Congress could not outlaw slavery. This changes the Constitution so they can, and they do. And what's going to end up happening, though, is very quickly the states pass laws to prevent black people from voting, even though they constitutionally are no longer slaves. There's all these laws called black codes that are put into effect to basically keep them in the position of slaves. Basically, there's all these restrictions targeted at black people, and kind of trying to deprive them of their rights, prevent them from voting, etc. Congress gets fed up with this, and the Republicans in Congress take over, and they have enough votes to override presidential vetoes, so they take over Reconstruction. They impose military rule, martial law on the South. They divide it up into military districts and put the Union Army in charge. And during this time, when the Union soldiers are there to protect African Americans, they actually make some progress. They gain some rights. They start to vote. And then that quickly, well, in some places they're allowed to vote, some places they're not. Congress is going to have to amend the Constitution a bit more. The 13th Amendment, we said, abolished slavery. There we go. The 14th Amendment is going to be anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen, because remember in the Dred Scott case, it said that black people were not citizens. This is going to change that. Anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen. 2, laws must treat all groups of people equally. No more of these laws that are aimed strictly at black people. This is called the Equal Protection Clause. This goes on and still is working today to protect different groups of people. For example, making sure that women have equal opportunities to men. 14th Amendment also has a part called the Due Process Clause that says states may not take away people's rights without due process. Now, states can take away people's rights. They can lock you up in jail, for example, but they have to follow a due process. The due process means there's a process put in place. You know, there has to be evidence, there has to be a trial, you have to have a lawyer. All of the process has to be correct. 15th Amendment finally gives African American men the right to vote. Just men, not women. This kind of causes a split with the women's suffrage movement. Women would not get the right to vote. Women of any race would not get the right to vote until 1920. All right, the Reconstruction here during this time period, African Americans do make some gains, but once Reconstruction ends, the KKK and laws passed by southern states called Jim Crow laws, they start to prevent blacks from having any rights and stop them from voting. And this is when Jim Crow and segregation kind of becomes the law of the land. Successes of Reconstruction. Was it a success? Was it a failure? Maybe it was both. Slavery was abolished. That's true. That's a big success. The U.S. was reunited. Also a big success. During the period of time Reconstruction was in effect, freedmen are the former slaves, did make some political and economic gains, and we amended the Constitution 3 times, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which are still benefiting Americans today. Failures, not enough done to help freedmen achieve equality. When Reconstruction ended, most African Americans lost most of their rights. Segregation and white supremacy became firmly established, and economically, African Americans as a whole have still not achieved equality with white people. So there are some successes, there are some failures. That is Reconstruction. That is all you need to know from me, but please watch the other Mr. Betts video as well. I will go in the same order for the questions. Feel free to watch the video while answering questions that might be helpful, and I will see you soon. Have a great day.